Sold as tribute to the gods, a young noblewoman finds her fate sealed in an arranged marriage to a ruthless pharaoh. Trapped in a court where no one accepts her, Nefertari fights against the chains of duty and desire, desperate to escape a destiny she never chose. But as Ramses' secrets come to light, she realizes their union is more than just a political symbol. It is a battle for power, divine legacy, and, against all odds, a love that defies those who seek to destroy it. What began as a prison becomes something unexpected, and what the pharaoh does with her changes everything. The sun beat down mercilessly on the alabaster columns of the great house as Nefertari stood in the shaded courtyard, her slender fingers trembling as they clutched the papyrus scroll. The message it contained had shattered her world like a clay vessel dropped from the highest terrace of her father's estate. Her dark eyes, rimmed with kohl that now threatened to streak with unshed tears, scanned the hieroglyphs once more, hoping desperately that she had misunderstood. By order of the living Horus, Lord of the Two Lands, mighty bull, beloved of Ma'at, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Ramses, second of his name, the daughter of the noble house of Amunhotep, shall be delivered to the royal palace as settlement for outstanding tributes owed to the crown. They can't do this, she whispered, though she knew full well they could and would. Her father's gambling had finally caught up with him, his debts so vast they could only be paid with the most valuable thing he possessed, his daughter. "My lady," Iset, her childhood nurse, approached with reddened eyes. "The royal guards have arrived. Your father awaits you in the great hall." The walk through her family home felt like a funeral procession. Servants lined the corridors, heads bowed, some openly weeping. These walls, these gardens, this was the only world Nefertari had ever known. Now, at 19, she was to be traded like a bolt of fine linen. Lord Amenhotep stood in the center of the great hall, his once proud shoulders now stooped beneath his pleated robe. The golden jewelry that adorned his neck and wrists, symbols of his noble standing, seemed to mock him now. "Daughter," he said, his voice cracking like papyrus beneath a scribe's knife. "You must understand there was no other way." Nefertari lifted her chin, summoning the pride that generations of noble blood had instilled in her. "Was there no other way, father? Or was it simply that all other paths required sacrifice from you rather than from me?" Her father flinched as though struck. "The pharaoh's men gave me no choice. The royal treasury has called in all debts. Those who cannot pay." He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Imprisonment, forced labor, or worse awaited those who defied the crown. "And so I am to be a slave in the royal harem?" Nefertari asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "No," her father whispered, almost too softly to hear. "You are to be his wife." The room seemed to tilt beneath Nefertari's feet. Wife? The pharaoh has a great royal wife, and many lesser wives besides. Why would he? "Politics," her father interrupted, with a hollow laugh. "Our family still has connections to the priests of Amun. The pharaoh seeks to strengthen his ties to the temple, and," he hesitated, "they say he was impressed when he saw you at the festival of Opet last season." Nefertari remembered that day, the crowds, the procession, the weight of a stranger's gaze that had made her look up to find herself caught in the unflinching stare of Egypt's ruler. She had thought nothing of it then. The captain of the royal guard stepped forward, his patience clearly waning. "The royal barge awaits, my lady. We must depart before midday." "May I at least gather my belongings?" Nefertari asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "The pharaoh has provided all that his new wife will require," the captain replied, not unkindly. "You need bring nothing from this house." A life erased in an instant. Nothing of her past deemed worthy to accompany her into her future. Her mother appeared then, breaking protocol to rush forward and embrace her daughter. "Take this," she whispered, pressing something into Nefertari's palm, a small amulet of lapis lazuli carved with the symbol of Isis. "For protection," she murmured against Nefertari's ear. "And remember who you are. You are not just some nobleman's daughter. Your grandmother was of royal blood. Hold your head high in that palace." The journey down the Nile passed in a blur of sun-dappled water and the rhythmic chanting of the oarsmen. Nefertari sat beneath a canopy on the royal barge, watching as her hometown of Thebes grew smaller behind them. Ahead lay Memphis, the administrative capital where Pharaoh Ramses conducted the business of his vast empire. "Is he kind?" she asked suddenly, addressing the captain who stood nearby. The man's expression revealed nothing. "The son of Ra is just and mighty. He has expanded Egypt's borders and brought great wealth to the kingdom." Not an answer to her question, Nefertari noted. "They say he works from sunrise until well past midnight, offered a younger guard, earning a sharp look from his superior. That he knows the name of every commander in his army and can recite the yearly harvest figures from memory. They say many things about the living Horus, the captain cut in. I would do well to remember that gossip about the royal person is punishable by— I merely seek to know the man I am to call husband, Nefertari interrupted, surprised by her own boldness. The captain studied her for a long moment. The pharaoh is not known to take interest in his wives beyond what duty requires, he said finally. He spends his days with generals and architects, not in the women's quarters. Perhaps that will be a mercy for you, my lady. As the barge rounded a bend in the river, the great city of Memphis came into view, its temples and palaces gleaming white in the afternoon sun. At its heart stood the royal residence, a sprawling complex of courtyards and gardens, audience chambers, and private apartments. Somewhere within those walls waited Ramses II, ruler of the most powerful kingdom on earth, and her future husband. Remember, an older female attendant whispered as they approached the royal dock, do not speak unless spoken to. Keep your eyes lowered in his presence, and whatever you do not refuse him anything he asks of you. Nefertari nodded, though inside, a spark of defiance flickered. She might have been sold to pay her father's debts, but she would not surrender her spirit so easily. If fate had decreed she would be a pharaoh's wife, then she would be one he would not soon forget. As she stepped from the barge onto Egyptian soil, the golden royal standard of Ramses II fluttered overhead, casting rippling shadows across her path. A new life awaited her, one of luxury and constraint, of power and danger. The court of the pharaoh was said to be a nest of vipers, where whispers could kill as surely as any blade. A sudden commotion at the palace gates drew her attention. A procession was departing, soldiers in gleaming armor, nobles in fine linens, and at their center a figure in a golden war chariot. Though distant, there was no mistaking the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, nor the commanding presence of the man who wore it. Is that, she breathed. The living Horus departs for the northern borders, the captain confirmed. Word has come of Hittite movements near our territory. Then, when will the ceremony take place? Nefertari asked, relief and disappointment warring within her. That is not for me to know, my lady. For now, you will be taken to the women's palace, where you will be prepared for the day of your union. The captain gestured toward a group of richly dressed women who approached from the palace complex. The royal attendants will see to your needs. As Nefertari was led away, she glanced back once more at the departing procession, now nearly out of sight. The man she was to marry, the stranger who held her fate in his hands, was riding away to war without so much as a glance in her direction. Perhaps the captain was right. Perhaps the pharaoh's notorious indifference to his wives would indeed be a mercy. But as the palace doors closed behind her, Nefertari couldn't help but wonder what other surprises awaited her in this gilded cage, and what manner of man would return from the northern borders to claim her as his own. 7 days had passed since Nefertari's arrival at the royal palace, each one more bewildering than the last. The women's quarters, a labyrinth of airy chambers, hidden alcoves, and fragrant gardens, had become her entire world, though she'd yet to feel at home within its walls. Every corner seemed to harbor secrets. Every whispered conversation ceased the moment she approached. The water is scented with lotus and jasmine today, my lady, said Meret, the young handmaiden assigned to her. The girl's nimble fingers worked oil into Nefertari's dark hair, preparing her for her morning bath. The head priestess says it will please the gods, and perhaps the pharaoh upon his return. Nefertari caught the girl's gaze in the polished copper mirror. And when might that be? His return? Meret's eyes darted away. They say the campaign goes well, perhaps before the next full moon. They said many things in this place, Nefertari had learned, but spoke little truth directly. Information was currency in the royal household, traded cautiously and at great cost. You there, new girl? The sharp voice cut through the chamber like a knife. In the doorway stood Iset, chief concubine to the pharaoh and undisputed queen of the women's quarters during the great royal wife's frequent absences at her own palace. You're wanted in the Hall of Columns. The royal steward wishes to inspect you. Meret's hands stilled in Nefertari's hair, but my lady has not completed her morning preparations. Did I ask for your opinion, little mouse? Iset stepped closer, her heavily jeweled hands resting on her hips. Up close, Nefertari could see the fine lines around her eyes, carefully disguised with green malachite paint. When the royal steward commands, even a supposed future wife obeys. The emphasis on supposed was unmistakable. "Of course," Nefertari responded, rising gracefully from her seat. "I am at the royal household's disposal." This seemed to displease Iset, who had clearly hoped for resistance. The older woman sniffed. "At least put on something suitable. The pharaoh's household doesn't receive guests in bathing linens." When Iset had swept from the room, Meret exhaled shakily. "Be careful, my lady. The chief concubine has held the pharaoh's favor for 7 years. She will not surrender her position easily." "I seek no one's position," Nefertari replied, allowing Meret to help her into a simple white sheath dress. "I did not ask to be here. Nevertheless, you are here, and that makes you a threat to many." Meret fastened a broad collar of beads around Nefertari's neck, whispering, "The royal steward Pentu serves many masters besides the pharaoh. Watch what you say to him." The Hall of Columns lived up to its name, an impressive forest of painted pillars soaring toward a ceiling adorned with stars. Morning light streamed through narrow clerestory windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. At the far end stood a thin man with a shaved head, consulting a papyrus scroll. "Pentu," a guard announced, "the Lady Nefertari, daughter of Amunhotep." The steward looked up, dark eyes appraising her with clinical detachment. "So this is our pharaoh's latest acquisition." Nefertari bit her tongue, tasting the copper tang of anger. "An acquisition? A thing purchased to settle a debt. Come closer, girl. Let me look at you." She approached, conscious of several scribes and officials who had paused in their work to observe the exchange. Pentu circled her slowly, like a buyer inspecting livestock. Passable features. Good posture. "Your father boasted of your education. They say you can read and write." "I can," Nefertari answered, keeping her voice level. "A waste of instruction for a woman," Pentu remarked dismissively. "But our pharaoh has his peculiarities." He consulted his scroll again. "You understand your position here. You are not yet wife to the living Horus. Merely promised. The ceremony awaits his return and his final approval." "I understand." "Good. Then you will also understand that until such time, you hold no rank here. You will learn our ways. You will observe proper protocols. You will not speak to the pharaoh unless spoken to. You will not enter certain areas of the palace without permission." Pentu's thin lips curved in what might generously be called a smile. "The last girl who forgot these rules was sent home to her family in disgrace. I understand she is now married to an elderly tomb painter in some provincial backwater." The threat hung in the air between them. "Is that all, Steward Pentu?" Nefertari asked, meeting his gaze steadily. A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, crossed his features before he recovered. "For now, you're dismissed." Later, as Nefertari returned to her chambers, she found herself taking a wrong turn in the vast palace complex. The passageway narrowed, the air growing cooler and heavy with the scent of incense. Before she could turn back, she heard voices approaching and instinctively stepped into a shadowed alcove. "Cannot allow it," a woman's voice hissed. "The pharaoh has entrusted us with preserving the royal bloodline. This nobody from Thebes has no place in his bed, let alone as a royal wife." "Patience, Henutmire," came the measured response, a man's voice resonant with authority. "The living Horus plays a deeper game than you perceive. He is besotted with her face. I saw him at the Opet festival, the way he watched her. My brother thinks with his careful priestess. Those are dangerous words, even for the pharaoh's sister." Nefertari's heart pounded. The pharaoh's sister, and she had spoken of him watching Nefertari at the festival, just as her father had claimed. "The priest of Ptah has examined the omens," the male voice continued. "They say this union is ill-fated. Perhaps we need not interfere at all." "Omens can be reinterpreted," Henutmire replied coldly. "I want that girl gone before my brother returns. See to it, Vizier." Nefertari pressed herself deeper into the shadows as the speakers moved past her hiding place, a tall woman in the leopard skin robes of a high priestess, and beside her, an older man with the sidelock of a royal vizier. Neither glanced in her direction, but Nefertari held her breath until their footsteps faded. When she finally returned to her chambers, Meret rushed to her side. "My lady, we've been searching everywhere. The priestesses have called for you. They wish to begin your purification rituals immediately." "Purification?" "For your upcoming union with the living Horus. It is customary for royal brides to undergo 7 days of cleansing and preparation." Meret lowered her voice. "They say the pharaoh's messenger arrived an hour ago. The Hittites have retreated. He returns within 3 days." 3 days. The knowledge settled over Nefertari like a weighted net. In 3 days she would meet the man who had purchased her, the man whose sister and advisors already plotted against their union. "Come, my lady," Meret urged, misreading her hesitation. The priestesses do not like to be kept waiting. As Nefertari followed her handmaiden through the palace corridors, she felt the weight of unseen eyes following her progress. From behind latticed screens and pillared galleries, the women of the royal household watched the newcomer, this unexpected rival who had appeared in their carefully balanced world. Some, she knew, watched with curiosity, others with calculation, and at least one high priestess watched with outright malice. The temple of Hathor within the palace complex smelled of myrrh and lotus flowers. 6 priestesses awaited her, their expressions unreadable beneath ceremonial masks depicting the cow-headed goddess of love and beauty. "Disrobe," commanded the tallest figure, her voice muffled behind her golden mask. "You come before the goddess as you came into this world." As Meret helped remove her garments, Nefertari sensed this was more than mere ritual. It was her first test in this place of perpetual trials. "Step into the sacred pool," the priestess instructed, gesturing to a small basin fed by an underground spring. "Be cleansed of your past life, that you may be worthy of the living Horus." The water was shockingly cold against her skin, raising gooseflesh along her arms. Nefertari forced herself to remain composed, even as the priestesses began to circle her, chanting in low, rhythmic tones. "Do you come willingly to the bed of the son of Ra?" asked the lead priestess, a loaded question. Everyone in this room knew she had been traded like cattle. To claim willingness would be a lie. To deny it would be an insult to the pharaoh. "I come as the gods have ordained," Nefertari answered carefully, "as Ma'at has balanced the scales of my destiny." A murmur passed through the priestesses. Approval or derision, she could not tell. "Clever," whispered one, too low for the others to hear. "But cleverness alone will not protect you in this place, daughter of Amunhotep." As cold water trickled down her spine, Nefertari realized the full gravity of her situation. She stood naked and vulnerable, surrounded by women who served powers far greater than herself, women who had already decided her fate. Yet something her mother had whispered during their farewell came back to her now. "Remember who you are. Your grandmother was of royal blood." Perhaps she had more allies in this treacherous court than she knew. Perhaps somewhere in the vast royal lineage, she had connections yet undiscovered. Connections that might explain why the mighty Ramses had chosen her, above all others, to be his next wife. The lead priestess raised her hands, signaling the conclusion of the ritual. "You may dress," she announced. "Tomorrow you will return for the anointing of the sacred oils. For tonight you will fast and pray to Hathor that she may make you fertile in your union." As Nefertari stepped from the pool, water streaming from her body, she caught the eye of the youngest priestess, a girl hardly older than herself, whose mask had slipped just enough to reveal a face that seemed oddly familiar. The girl quickly adjusted her mask, but not before Nefertari had seen the unmistakable resemblance to the profile depicted on royal monuments throughout Egypt. Another royal sibling, perhaps, another player in this dangerous game. Later, as Nefertari lay awake in her chamber, the palace around her finally quiet in the deep of night, she turned her mother's amulet over in her palm, its smooth surface cool against her skin. "Guide me through these treacherous waters," she whispered to the carved image of Isis. "Help me understand the currents that have brought me here." Outside her window, the stars wheeled slowly across the night sky, the same stars that shone over the pharaoh's distant camp, where Ramses II, soon to be her husband, perhaps looked up and pondered his own inscrutable designs. What manner of man was he? A ruthless conqueror, as foreign emissaries claimed, a cold strategist, as his steward suggested, or something more complex, hidden beneath the heavy crown of his office? In 3 days' time, Nefertari would begin to discover the truth for herself. But first, she would need to survive the viper's nest of the royal court, where every smile concealed sharp teeth, and where a nobleman's daughter from Thebes was never meant to thrive. The royal barge cut through the waters of the Nile like a knife through linen, its gilded prow catching the first light of dawn. In the distance, the palace of Memphis grew larger with each stroke of the oars, its white limestone walls gleaming like polished bone against the sky. On the horizon behind it, the great pyramids of the ancients stood as silent witnesses to the returning pharaoh's triumph. Ramses II, Lord of the Two Lands, stood at the bow, his muscular frame silhouetted against the rising sun. Though he had been traveling for days, his posture betrayed no fatigue. The double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt rested beside him on a cushion of purple silk. But even without it, there was no mistaking the regal bearing of Egypt's ruler. "We approach the royal dock, Divine One," his commander, Amenemhat, announced, bowing deeply. "The palace has been notified of your arrival." Ramses nodded once, his profile as sharp and unmoving as those carved into his monuments. At 32 years of age, he had already ruled for 7 years. 7 years of military campaigns, massive building projects, and ruthless consolidation of power. The boy who had once trained alongside common soldiers now stood alone, elevated above all men, closer to the gods than to his subjects. "Tell me of this girl again," he said suddenly, his deep voice carrying no further than his commander's ears. "This Nefertari." Amenemhat hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "She is not what one would expect, my king. The daughter of Amenhotep has spirit. The palace servants say she carries herself like one born to royalty, though her father's family has only held noble rank for 3 generations. And my sister, how does she receive my bride-to-be?" A diplomatic pause. "The divine Henetmaya has been attentive to the girl's preparation for your union." A cold smile flickered across Ramses' face, "which means she plots against her already." He gazed contemplatively at the approaching palace. "And my great royal wife. The divine merit remains at her residence in Thebes, my king. A message arrived yesterday claiming she is too ill to travel for the ceremony." "Convenient," Ramses murmured. Both men knew the illness was nothing more than protest. Merit, daughter of a powerful noble family and his wife of 12 years, had made no secret of her displeasure at this new addition to the royal household. As the barge docked, Ramses finally reached for his crown, settling its considerable weight upon his close-shaven head. The moment it touched his brow, his expression changed, becoming the impassive mask his subjects expected. Remote, forbidding, divine. "Remember your purpose," he said quietly to Amenemhat. "Watch her. Report to me alone." The commander bowed deeply. "As you command, living Horus." The royal procession wound through the streets of Memphis, past crowds that prostrated themselves as their god-king passed. Children scattered lotus blossoms before his golden chariot. Temple singers raised their voices in hymns to his glory. To the common people, Ramses was more myth than man, a living embodiment of Egypt's might, as distant and powerful as the sun itself. None could see the calculation behind his eyes, as he acknowledged their worship with practiced gestures. None could know how the great pharaoh's mind worked ceaselessly, plotting moves and counter-moves in the intricate game of empire. "The Hittites retreat for now," he had told his war council before departing the northern borders. "But they will return when their forces are reinforced. We have perhaps a season before we must face them again." "Then why not pursue them now, Divine One?" a young general had asked. "Crush them while they are weakened." Ramses had fixed the man with a stare that made seasoned warriors flinch. "Because, General Pesa, I have ruled long enough to know when to strike and when to wait. The coming battle will be fought on ground of my choosing, not in the rocky passes where they hold advantage." The real reason remained unspoken. The royal treasury, drained by his father's excesses, and his own ambitious building programs, needed time to replenish. Hence the sudden collection of debts from nobles like Amenhotep, and hence the need for strategic marriages to consolidate support among the priestly class. It was all part of a greater design, a design that even his closest advisors glimpsed only in fragments. By midday, Ramses had retired to his private chambers within the palace, dismissed his attendants, and finally allowed his shoulders to relax from their rigid posture. Here, in the few rooms where he could be certain no eyes watched and no ears listened, the god became merely a man again. A man with aching muscles from weeks in the saddle and a pounding headache from the weight of his ceremonial crown. A light knock at the door interrupted his rare moment of solitude. "Enter," he commanded, instantly resuming his regal bearing. A young boy appeared, Panifer, his personal cupbearer, one of the few servants permitted in these inner sanctums. "Divine One, your sacred bath is prepared, and the royal steward requests an audience regarding the ceremonies to come." Ramses waved a dismissive hand. "Tell Pentu I will see him at sunset. For now I wish to rest." "Yes, Divine One." The boy hesitated. "There is one other matter." "Speak." The Lady Nefertari asked if she might pay her respects to the living Horus upon his return. This caught Ramses' interest. According to custom, a royal bride did not address or approach the pharaoh until the wedding ceremony itself. For her to request an audience showed either ignorance of protocol or deliberate defiance of it. Did she indeed? A thoughtful pause. Tell her I will grant her request. She may attend me during the evening meal. As the boy departed, Ramses moved to a small side chamber where a polished copper mirror hung on the wall. He studied his reflection clinically, the strong jaw, the aquiline nose, the eyes that generals found so unnerving. Not handsome, perhaps, but a face that commanded respect. A face carefully cultivated to reveal nothing of the mind behind it. What would this girl from Thebes see when she looked upon him? The fearsome ruler whose name caused foreign kings to tremble, the cold strategist whose calculations had expanded Egypt's borders further than any pharaoh since the great Thutmose, or merely a man who had purchased her to settle her father's debts. The thought displeased him, though he could not say why. Later, as the evening star rose over the eastern desert, Ramses sat alone in his private dining chamber. The low table before him held the finest delicacies from throughout his empire: roasted duck with pomegranate, fish fresh from the Nile, figs and dates imported at great expense from distant lands. He had touched none of it. Instead, he read through the papyrus scrolls his scribes had prepared during his absence, tax reports from the southern provinces, architectural plans for his great temple at Abu Simbel, intelligence regarding the movements of Hittite troops near the Syrian border. The business of empire never ceased, even for a single day. The Lady Nefertari, daughter of Amunhotep, announced the guard at the door. Ramses did not look up immediately. Let her wait, let her wonder at his reaction. He continued studying the scroll before him for several long moments before finally raising his eyes. She stood in the doorway, dressed simply but elegantly in white linen that fell in pleasing folds from her shoulders. A single band of gold encircled her upper arm, her only ornament besides the ceremonial collar at her throat. Her black hair had been styled in the traditional fashion, framing a face that was indeed as striking as he remembered from the Opet festival. But it was her eyes that arrested him, dark, intelligent, and utterly unafraid. Where other women trembled in his presence, she met his gaze directly, her posture neither subservient nor challenging, but dignified. "You requested an audience," he said, his tone neutral. "Approach." She moved forward with a grace that spoke of years of careful training, stopping at the precise distance that protocol dictated, close enough to converse, far enough to show proper deference. Then, to his surprise, she knelt in the formal position, touching her forehead briefly to the floor, before rising again to a seated posture. "I thank the living Horus for granting my request," she said, her voice melodious and controlled. "I wish to offer my congratulations on your victory against the Hittite forces." An unexpected opening. Most women of the court began with flattery about his divine appearance or professions of their unworthiness. "Victory is too strong a word," he replied, testing her. "The Hittites withdrew. They are not defeated." "Yet they withdrew before the might of Egypt," she observed. "That alone will strengthen your position when treaty negotiations begin." Ramses felt his interest quicken. How did this girl know of the planned treaty negotiations? Such matters were discussed only in the War Council. "You seem well informed for one who has spent mere days in the royal household," he remarked, watching her carefully. A faint smile touched her lips. "My father may have been reckless with his finances, Divine One, but he did not neglect my education. The movements of empires have been my study since childhood. An unusual subject for a nobleman's daughter, perhaps." Her gaze remained steady, "but useful it seems for the future wife of a pharaoh." Boldness indeed. Ramses found himself intrigued, despite his natural caution. "And do you wish to be the wife of a pharaoh, Nefertari, daughter of Amunhotep? Or are you merely accepting the fate the gods have decreed?" The directness of the question clearly surprised her, but she recovered quickly. "I believe, Divine One, that accepting what the gods decree and shaping one's destiny are not mutually exclusive actions." A diplomatic answer, skillfully delivered. Ramses allowed himself a small nod of acknowledgement. "You speak like one trained in the temple schools." "My grandmother served as a priestess of Isis in her youth," Nefertari explained. "She taught me that wisdom lies in seeing the currents that move beneath the surface of events." "And what currents do you see here in this marriage arranged to settle a debt?" The question hung between them, weighted with implication. For a moment, Ramses thought he had pushed too far, had seen a flicker of hurt cross her features. But when she answered, her voice remained composed. "I see a pharaoh who requires alliances with the priesthood of Amun during a time of military expansion. I see a noble family with ancient ties to that priesthood, despite their recent financial troubles." And I see myself, here she paused, choosing her words with visible care, as the vessel through which those interests might converge. Ramses leaned back, genuinely surprised by her perception. Most saw only the surface arrangement, a debt collection, a convenient marriage. Few recognized the deeper political calculations involved. You do not speak as one raised in Thebes, he observed. The provinces are not as provincial as the court might believe. Divine One. Was that a hint of pride in her voice? A touch of defiance? Ramses found himself more engaged in this conversation than in any he had experienced in months. The dull pageantry of court life, the endless flattery, the careful evasions, the layers of ritual that separated him from genuine human contact, suddenly felt oppressive by comparison. They say you can read and write, he said, changing direction abruptly. Is this true? It is, Divine One. In all three scripts? Hieroglyphic, hieratic, and demotic? She nodded. And some Babylonian cuneiform, though my skill there is limited. Remarkable, if true. Even among priests, such comprehensive literacy was uncommon. Show me, he commanded, gesturing to the writing materials that always accompanied him. Copy this passage. He selected a scroll from the table, a complex religious text concerning the judgment of souls in the afterlife. Nefertari accepted the reed pen and ink palette without hesitation, her fingers moving with practiced ease as she began to transcribe the hieroglyphs onto a blank sheet of papyrus. Ramses watched her work, noting the confident strokes, the proper proportions of each sacred symbol. No hesitation, no uncertainty. When she had completed a full column, he held out his hand for the result. Perfect. Not merely accurate, but executed with an elegance that spoke of years of practice. My tutors would be gratified by your approval, Divine One, she said, a hint of pride warming her voice. For the first time since her arrival, Ramses allowed himself to truly look at her, not as a political pawn or an acquired obligation, but as the woman who might soon share his name and royal cartouche. The lamplight caught the fine angles of her face, illuminating intelligence in eyes that most would have trained to show only submission. Why did you request this audience? He asked suddenly. The truth, not the polite fiction about congratulating my victory. Nefertari hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. I wish to know what manner of man I am to marry, she answered simply. The pharaoh is spoken of in many ways throughout your kingdom, as a warrior without equal, as a builder whose monuments will outlast the stars, as a ruler whose word is absolute. But of Ramses the man, little is said. The distinction between Ramses the pharaoh and Ramses the man was one few dared to make in his presence. The implication that there might be a difference between the two bordered on blasphemy. Yet instead of anger, he felt something almost like relief at having the division acknowledged. And what have you learned from this brief audience? He asked, his voice quieter than before. Nefertari considered her answer carefully. That the man is as formidable as the pharaoh, she said finally. But perhaps not as unknowable as court gossip would suggest. Ramses felt the corner of his mouth twitch, nearly a smile, an expression so rare his closest advisors might not have recognized it. A diplomatic assessment, he observed, though perhaps premature. He rose then, signaling the end of their audience. Nefertari immediately stood and bowed, understanding the unspoken command. The ceremony will take place in 3 days, as tradition dictates, he told her. Until then, you will continue your preparation with the priestesses. As the living Horus commands, she replied, the formal response expected of her. As she turned to leave, Ramses spoke once more. Nefertari. She paused, looking back. My sister does not approve of our union, he said bluntly, nor do certain factions within the priesthood. You would do well to guard against their attentions. Her eyes widened slightly at this unexpected warning. Thank you, Divine One. When she had gone, Ramses returned to his scrolls, though his mind no longer focused on the words before him. The girl was not what he had expected, not a simpering courtier's daughter, not a frightened sacrifice to royal whim. There was substance there, a quality rare enough in the royal court to be worthy of note. Perhaps this marriage of political convenience might prove more interesting than he had anticipated. Perhaps for once the gods had aligned duty with something approaching pleasure. But such thoughts were dangerous indulgences for a pharaoh whose every decision affected millions. Sentiment had no place in the calculus of empire. Whatever his personal impressions of Nefertari, daughter of Amunhotep, her value lay in the alliances she would cement, the legitimacy she would lend to his reign. Ramses turned his attention back to the military reports before him. his expression once more becoming the inscrutable mask his subjects knew so well. The brief moment of connection, of humanity, receded like the Nile after the annual flood, leaving behind only the hard, sun-baked surface of pharaonic authority. And yet as the night deepened around him, the memory of intelligent eyes meeting his without fear remained, a current moving beneath the surface of his thoughts, subtle but undeniable. The temple of Amun in Thebes blazed with 1,000 oil lamps, their golden light reflecting off polished stone floors and illuminating vast columns that soared toward the heavens. Incense smoke curled through the air in fragrant tendrils, mingling with the scent of roasted meats and sweet wines that filled the outer courtyard. Tonight marked the celebration of Ramses's recent victory against the Hittites, a grand feast that had drawn nobility from throughout the two lands. Nefertari stood at the edge of the festivities, observing the intricate dance of power that unfolded before her. Though 3 weeks had passed since her wedding to the pharaoh, a ceremony conducted with all the pomp and spectacle befitting Egypt's ruler, she still felt like an outsider in this glittering world of ancient bloodlines and labyrinthine alliances. "You look lost in thought, my queen," came a voice at her shoulder. She turned to find Pesa, the young general whose tactical suggestions had been so quickly dismissed by Ramses at the War Council. In the days since, she had learned he was the son of one of Egypt's oldest noble families, and a man whose ambition was whispered about in the palace corridors. "Not lost, General," she replied with a measured smile, "merely observing." "And what do you observe?" he asked, following her gaze across the crowded courtyard. "A battlefield of a different sort," Nefertari answered truthfully. "The weapons may be words and glances rather than spears and arrows, but the stakes seem no less high." Pasa's laugh held genuine amusement. "You adapt quickly to court life, my queen. Many take years to recognize the war that rages beneath the pleasant surface of royal gatherings." Across the courtyard, Nefertari could see Ramses deep in conversation with the high priest of Amun, their heads bent close together despite the celebratory atmosphere. Even from this distance, she could read the tension in her husband's posture, the slight stiffness in his shoulders that betrayed his displeasure, though his face remained impassive as always. "Tell me, General Pesa," she said, keeping her tone conversational, "why does the priesthood of Amun hold such power? In Memphis, the cult of Ptah seems ascendant, yet here in Thebes, it is as though Amun's priests are kings themselves." The general's eyes narrowed fractionally, assessing her. "A complex question, my queen. The simple answer is wealth. The temple of Amun controls vast estates, perhaps a third of all cultivable land in Upper Egypt. But the deeper truth," he paused, glancing around before continuing in a lower voice, "the priesthood remembers when pharaohs were their puppets, not so many generations ago. Some whisper they wish for those days to return." A calculated revelation, Nefertari realized. Pasa was testing her, probing for her allegiances in the subtle power struggle that surrounded the throne. "And where do you stand in this delicate balance, General?" she asked, meeting his gaze directly. His smile widened. "Firmly with Egypt, my queen, always with Egypt." A diplomatic non-answer that revealed more than he perhaps intended. Before she could respond, a ripple of movement caught her attention. The crowd was parting as Ramses approached, his ceremonial regalia glinting in the lamplight. Pasa immediately bowed low. "Divine One." "General," Ramses acknowledged coolly, "I trust you are not monopolizing the Queen's attention, merely offering the wisdom of my limited experience at court, Divine One." "Indeed." The single word carried unmistakable dismissal. Pasa bowed again and melted into the crowd, leaving Nefertari alone with her husband. For a long moment, Ramses said nothing, his eyes following the retreating figure of the general. "You should be cautious with that one," he finally murmured, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "His loyalty shifts with the desert winds." "I thought as much," Nefertari replied, "though he seems eager to curry favor with your new wife, as are many at court." Ramses turned to her fully now, his gaze assessing. "You have become a piece on the Senate board, my queen. Every faction seeks to claim you for their own." There was something almost like concern in his voice, an emotion Nefertari had rarely detected from the normally impassive pharaoh. "And to which faction would you have me belong, Divine One?" she asked carefully. The faintest smile touched his lips. "Mine, of course." Before she could respond to this surprisingly direct statement, a commotion erupted near the temple entrance. The assembled guests parted as a procession of litter-bearers entered, surrounding an ornate sedan chair draped in fine linen. As the chair was lowered to the ground, a woman emerged, regal, beautiful, and radiating cold fury despite her serene expression. "Merit," Ramses said, his face instantly resuming its inscrutable mask. "My great royal wife honors us with her presence." Nefertari felt her stomach tighten. Though she had been prepared for this moment since her arrival at court, the reality of facing Ramses' first wife, the woman who had held the title of Great Royal Wife for over a decade, sent a wave of anxiety through her. Merit approached with measured steps, her jeweled collar and crown catching the light with each movement. Though she must have been nearing her 30th year, her beauty remained striking. The high cheekbones, almond eyes, and full lips that had captured a young prince's heart long ago. "My king," she said, her voice melodious as she bowed before Ramses, "I could not miss such an important celebration of your triumph." Her gaze slid to Nefertari, coolly appraising. "And this must be your new acquisition." The deliberate insult hung in the air between them. Around them, conversations quieted as the court held its collective breath, waiting for the drama to unfold. Ramses's expression revealed nothing, but Nefertari felt the tension radiating from him. This public confrontation put him in an impossible position. To rebuke Merit would create scandal. To allow the slight would diminish his new wife's standing. Before he could respond, Nefertari stepped forward and performed a perfect court bow, deep enough to show respect to the great royal wife, but not so deep as to diminish her own status. "The divine Merit honors me with her attention," she said, her voice carrying clearly. "I have heard such stories of your wisdom and beauty since childhood. The court minstrels do not exaggerate." A murmur rippled through the watching nobles. It was a masterful response, acknowledging Merit's senior position, while subtly reminding all present that Nefertari herself was now royal, not merely an acquisition. Merit's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "How charming," she replied. "Such provincial freshness will certainly enliven the court for a time." "Merit." Ramses spoke her name as a warning, his tone causing several nearby courtiers to step back instinctively. The great royal wife inclined her head, acknowledging the rebuke, but the damage had been done. The battle lines had been drawn publicly for all the court to witness. The charged moment was broken by the arrival of the high priest of Amun, his elaborate headdress marking him as the supreme authority of Egypt's most powerful cult. "Divine ones," he intoned, bowing to both Ramses and Merit, before nodding to Nefertari with noticeably less deference. "The time has come for the sacred rituals of thanksgiving. If you would accompany me to the inner sanctuary." Ramses placed his hand lightly on Nefertari's arm, a public gesture of support that caused another ripple of whispers through the assembly. "My wife and I will attend you, High Priest." "Both wives, surely," Merit interjected smoothly. As is traditional, the High Priest's expression remained bland, but Nefertari caught the flash of calculation in his eyes. Of course, the great royal wife's presence is essential. However, the inner sanctuary's rites are reserved for those of established divine connection. Perhaps the new queen might wish to observe from the outer hall, where other noble women gather. Another calculated insult, this one sanctioned by religious authority. Nefertari felt her cheeks warm despite her efforts at composure. To her surprise, it was not Ramses who spoke in her defense, but a new voice, clear, authoritative, and unexpected. "My brother's wife carries royal blood in her veins," announced Princess Henutmaya, appearing suddenly at Nefertari's side. The pharaoh's sister, resplendent in her ceremonial robes as a priestess of Hathor, fixed the high priest with a piercing stare. Her grandmother was born of the royal line of Ahmose, before marrying into the Theban nobility. Her divine connection is as established as my own. Nefertari struggled to hide her shock. The princess who had plotted against her marriage now stood as her defender. The Senate Board of Court Politics had just shifted in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. The high priest faltered momentarily before recovering. "If the divine Henutmaya vouches for her lineage." "I do," the princess stated firmly, "and I will personally escort my brother's wife through the purification rituals." Ramses' face betrayed nothing, but Nefertari sensed his surprise. "Then it is settled," he declared. "Both my wives will attend the inner rites." Merit's perfect composure slipped for just an instant, revealing a flash of genuine anger before she mastered herself once more. "As the living Horus commands," she murmured, her eyes promising future retribution. As they proceeded toward the temple's sacred heart, Henutmaya fell into step beside Nefertari, speaking in a whisper too low for others to hear. "Do not mistake this for friendship, daughter of Amunhotep. I defend my brother's choices, not you. But I will not allow Panahesi," she nodded toward the high priest walking ahead of them, "to undermine royal authority through religious maneuvering." "I understand, Princess," Nefertari replied carefully, "and I thank you for your intervention." Henutmaya's lips curved in a smile that held little warmth. "You may yet prove useful in the games to come. For now, that is enough." The inner sanctuary of Amun's temple was a place few outsiders ever witnessed, a sacred space where gold leaf covered every surface, where the statue of the god himself stood shrouded in mystery, tended only by the highest-ranking priests. Incense filled the air so thickly that Nefertari found it difficult to breathe as they took their places for the ritual. The ceremony proceeded with ancient words and gestures, a pageant of devotion that predated even the pyramids. Through it all, Nefertari observed the subtle interactions around her, the way Merit positioned herself always at Ramses' right hand, the deference the high priest showed to certain nobles but not others, the calculating looks exchanged between courtiers when they thought no one was watching. When Ramses stepped forward to present offerings to the god, she noticed something that others might have missed: the slight stiffening of his shoulders as the high priest whispered something in his ear, the nearly imperceptible tightening of his jaw. Later, as they emerged from the stifling heat of the inner sanctuary into the relative coolness of the hypostyle hall, Nefertari found herself separated from the royal party, adrift in a sea of nobles eager to curry favor with the pharaoh. "An impressive performance," came a familiar voice. She turned to find the vizier, the same man she had overheard plotting with Henutmaya days earlier, watching her with shrewd eyes. "You navigate treacherous waters with surprising skill for one so new to our court." "You honor me, Vizier." "Kepa," he supplied, bowing slightly. "First Vizier to the living Horus. I knew your father in his better days. Before his debts consumed him," Nefertari acknowledged, seeing no benefit in pretending ignorance. Indeed, Kepa studied her with open curiosity. Most would have crumbled beneath Merit's disdain or the high priest's dismissal, yet you stand unbowed. One wonders what other surprises the daughter of Amunhotep might harbor. Before Nefertari could respond, a hand touched her elbow. Meret, her handmaiden, looking uncharacteristically anxious. "My queen," she whispered urgently, "you are needed. Please come quickly." Excusing herself from the vizier, Nefertari followed Meret through the crowd to a small antechamber off the main hall. There, to her surprise, she found a simple scribe bent over a papyrus scroll writing rapidly. "What is this?" she asked, confused by the urgency of the summons. Meret closed the door behind them. "Forgive me, my queen, but there was no other way to speak privately. This is my brother, Ipui. He serves as junior scribe to the Pharaoh's war council." The young man bowed deeply. "Great queen," he murmured, his voice barely audible, "I risk much by coming to you, but my sister believes you can be trusted." "Trusted with what?" Nefertari asked, her confusion deepening. Ipui glanced nervously at the closed door. "There are whispers among the military scribes. The campaign against the Hittites, it did not go as the public celebrations suggest. Our forces were not victorious. They were nearly defeated. The withdrawal was not a Hittite retreat, but a negotiated pause." The revelation struck Nefertari like a physical blow. "Why tell me this?" "Because," Meret interjected, "the high priest and his faction seek to use this information against the pharaoh. They will claim the gods have withdrawn their favor because of his unconventional choice of wife." Understanding dawned. "Me. They will blame me for the military setback." Ipui nodded grimly. "They plan to announce it during tonight's feast, to publicly question whether the pharaoh's judgment in marriage reflects a greater failing in his leadership." "How can you possibly know this?" Nefertari demanded. "Because I was ordered to prepare the scrolls of omen interpretations that will prove divine displeasure," the scribe explained. "The high priest's faction moves against you tonight, my queen, and through you against the pharaoh himself." Nefertari's mind raced. This was no mere court intrigue, but a direct challenge to Ramses' authority, using her as the pretext. If successful, it could force him to set her aside to appease the powerful priesthood. "Why help me?" she asked, studying both siblings carefully. "You risk everything." Meret and Ipui exchanged glances. "Our father served in the pharaoh's personal guard," Meret explained softly. "When he was killed defending the royal person during an assassination attempt, Ramses provided for our family when he had no obligation to do so. We serve the man, not merely the crown." Nefertari nodded slowly, understanding at last. How much time do we have? They will make their move at the height of the feast, when the wine has flowed freely and all are assembled to hear the pharaoh's address, Ipui replied. Perhaps an hour, no more. An hour to counter a plot months in the making. Nefertari felt the weight of impossibility pressing down upon her, yet surrender was unthinkable. In just weeks, she had gone from being a nobleman's daughter to the wife of Egypt's ruler. Now, suddenly, she found herself at the center of a power struggle that could determine the future of the two lands themselves. Return to your duties, she instructed the scribe. Speak of this to no one. Merit, find General Amenemhat, only him, mind you, and ask him to meet me by the statue of Sekhmet in the outer courtyard. Say it concerns the pharaoh's safety. As they hurried to obey, Nefertari closed her eyes briefly, gathering her courage. The feast at the temple of Amun had indeed revealed the tensions and power games within the court, but with stakes far higher than she could have imagined. Before this night was through, she would either establish herself as a true queen of Egypt or find herself cast aside, another forgotten footnote in the endless annals of pharaonic history. And somewhere in the crowded temple, the great celebration continued unabated, wine flowing freely, as nobles and priests alike positioned themselves for the dramatic confrontation to come, a confrontation that would test not only the new queen's resolve, but the pharaoh's grip on the throne itself. Dawn broke over Memphis, painting the limestone walls of the palace in hues of gold and rose. 2 months had passed since the fateful feast at the temple of Amun. 2 months of careful maneuvering, shifting alliances, and tense silences. Nefertari had survived the high priest's attempted coup that night, though not through her own actions alone. Ramses himself had outmaneuvered his opponents, having been forewarned by General Amenemhat, who had received Nefertari's urgent message. The outcome had surprised everyone at court. Instead of dismissing the accusations outright, Ramses had acknowledged the military setback against the Hittites, turning what was meant to be a moment of embarrassment into a display of pharaonic wisdom. Only a foolish king hides the truth from his people, he had declared before the assembled nobles. The Hittites are formidable opponents, and our campaign continues. The gods test Egypt's resolve, not her worthiness. It had been a masterful performance, one that had left the high priest and his faction momentarily outmaneuvered, but in the weeks since, tensions had only grown. The palace hummed with whispers of coming conflict, not just with foreign powers, but within Egypt itself. Nefertari stood on the balcony of her chambers, watching the city stir to life below. Servants moved through the gardens, merchants set up their wares in the marketplace, and children played along the banks of the great river, all unaware of the power struggles happening within the palace walls above them. "My queen," Meret called softly from the doorway, "the pharaoh has called a war council. He requests your presence." Nefertari turned, unable to hide her surprise. "My presence? At the war council?" Such a request was unprecedented. The war council was the exclusive domain of men, generals, scribes, and the pharaoh himself. For a queen to be invited, especially one as new to her position as Nefertari, was extraordinary. Those were his exact words, "My queen. Tell my wife her presence is required." Meret's expression betrayed her own confusion. The divine Meret has already departed for her palace in Thebes, so there can be no mistake. As Nefertari followed her handmaiden through the palace corridors, she felt the weight of curious gazes following her progress. Word of Ramses' unusual summons had clearly spread quickly. Some courtiers looked merely intrigued, others openly disapproving. A queen had her proper sphere of influence: religion, household management, court ceremonies, but military matters had always remained firmly outside a royal wife's purview. The council chamber fell silent as she entered. A dozen men sat around a large table covered with papyrus maps, small figurines representing troop movements, carefully positioned across the painted landscape. Ramses stood at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as always. "Divine One," Nefertari said, bowing deeply before her husband. "You summoned me." "Sit," he replied, gesturing to an empty chair at his right hand, a position of honor that caused several of the generals to exchange glances. As she took her seat, she could feel the resistance in the room, the silent questioning of her presence in this sacred male domain. Vizier Keeper's face remained diplomatically blank, but General Passer made little effort to hide his disapproval. "As I was saying," Ramses continued, as though the interruption of a woman joining their council was entirely normal, "the Hittite forces have regrouped at Kadesh. Our scouts report they have formed alliances with several Syrian princes, strengthening their numbers considerably. Then we must strike before these alliances solidify, General Pausa declared, moving a figurine aggressively across the map. A force of 20,000 moving up the coast, through terrain that favors ambush and where our chariots would be at a disadvantage, interrupted another general, older and more weathered than Pausa. It would be a slaughter. General Horemheb suggests caution where boldness is required, Pausa replied with barely concealed disdain. Perhaps his many years have made him overly cautious. Or perhaps they have taught him to count the cost in men's lives before making rash decisions, Horemheb countered, his voice hardening. Ramses watched the exchange impassively, his eyes moving between the two men as they argued. Nefertari studied her husband carefully, noting the slight tension around his mouth. This was a division he had seen before, she realized. The council was split between the aggressive approach favored by younger officers like Pausa and the more measured strategy advocated by veterans like Horemheb. What resources do we have available? She asked quietly, addressing her question to the royal scribe who sat documenting the council's discussions. The room fell silent once more, all eyes turning to her in shock. Even Ramses raised an eyebrow, though whether in disapproval or interest, she couldn't tell. The scribe looked to the pharaoh for permission before answering. Ramses nodded once. The treasury can support a force of 15,000 for 3 months, the scribe replied hesitantly, though the recent flooding has been less bountiful than hoped, affecting tax collection in the delta regions. And our grain reserves? Nefertari pressed, ignoring the growing discomfort in the room. Sufficient for the army, my queen, but the civilian population will face shortages if the campaign extends into harvest season, she finished for him, which would lead to unrest in the northern provinces, precisely where we need stability to support military operations. General Pausa's face flushed with anger. With all due respect, my queen, these considerations are essential to any military strategy, Ramses interrupted, his tone making it clear further objection would not be tolerated. Continue, wife. Emboldened by her husband's support, Nefertari rose from her seat and moved to the map. Years of studying military history with her grandmother's tutors had prepared her for this moment, though she had never imagined actually applying such knowledge. The Hittites expect us to respond with force, she began, her finger tracing a path across the painted landscape. They believe Pharaoh cannot afford to appear weak after the previous engagement ended in stalemate. They will have prepared for a direct assault. As we should deliver, Pausa insisted. To do otherwise would indeed show weakness. To do what is expected is to surrender advantage, Nefertari countered. My father lost his fortune at the Senate board because his moves were predictable. His opponents anticipated his strategy and positioned accordingly. She moved several of the figurines on the map, creating a new configuration. Instead of marching directly to Kadesh, split the army. Send a small force, big enough to be noticed, along the expected route, but moved the main body here through the eastern hill country. General Horemheb leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. Difficult terrain, but if we moved at night, the Hittites would commit their forces against what they believe to be our main army, Nefertari continued, while our actual strength falls upon their flank. A deception, Ramses said thoughtfully. But the force we send as bait would suffer heavy casualties. Not if they are instructed to avoid direct engagement, Nefertari replied. Their purpose would be to be seen, to be reported to Hittite commanders, but to withdraw before actual battle is joined. A feint, Horemheb nodded, growing enthusiasm evident in his voice. It could work, Divine One. It's women's tactics, Pausa objected, unable to contain his disdain. Trickery and deception rather than honorable confrontation. Nefertari met his gaze steadily. Is the objective to uphold some notion of battlefield honor, General Pausa, or to win with minimal Egyptian casualties? The room fell silent at her direct challenge to the young general. All eyes turned to Ramses, awaiting his response to this unprecedented situation. A queen not only participating in the war council, but openly challenging one of his commanders. To everyone's surprise, including Nefertari's, a faint smile touched the pharaoh's lips. My wife asks a pertinent question, General. What is our objective here? Pausa struggled visibly to master his emotions. To secure victory for Egypt, of course, Divine One. Then we shall use whatever strategy best achieves that end, Ramses declared. He studied the map arrangement Nefertari had created, his expression thoughtful. The deception has merit, but the timing must be precise. General Horemheb, you will command the main force through the eastern approach. General Pausa, the diversionary force will be yours. Pausa's expression flickered between outrage at being given the lesser command and recognition of the political impossibility of refusing. "As the living Horus commands," he said stiffly. "Divine One," Vizier Kepper interjected smoothly, speaking for the first time since Nefertari's arrival. "While this strategy has interesting elements, we must consider the diplomatic implications. The Hittite king has sent envoys suggesting a possible treaty. Perhaps military action is premature when words might suffice." "Words backed by the credible threat of force," Ramses corrected. "We negotiate from strength, not conciliation." He turned to the assembled council. "We proceed with preparations as discussed. I will make my final decision after reviewing the detailed plans tomorrow." With that clear dismissal, the generals and officials bowed and began to file from the chamber. Only when the last of them had departed did Ramses turn his full attention to his wife. "You surprised them today," he observed, his tone neutral. "I surprised myself," Nefertari admitted. "I never expected you to summon me to the War Council, nor did I expect you to immediately challenge my generals with an alternative strategy." There was a hint of amusement in his voice, so faint she might have imagined it. "Where did you learn military tactics, daughter of Amunhotep?" "My grandmother insisted I be educated in all matters of statecraft," Nefertari replied. "She believed knowledge was a woman's best defense in a world ruled by men." "A wise woman," Ramses acknowledged, "though I doubt she anticipated you applying such knowledge in a pharaoh's war council." Nefertari hesitated, then asked the question that had been foremost in her mind. "Why did you summon me today, Divine One? Surely not because you anticipated I would have strategic insights to offer." Ramses turned away, moving to a window that overlooked the palace grounds. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Nefertari wondered if she had overstepped the bounds of their still formal relationship. "The council is divided," he said finally, "between cautious veterans like Horemheb and ambitious young officers like Passer. Neither faction sees the full picture." He glanced back at her. "Sometimes a fresh perspective reveals what has been overlooked by those too set in their thinking. And you thought I might provide this perspective? I thought you might observe the dynamics at play," he corrected. "Your intervention with the strategy was unexpected." There was something he wasn't saying, something more behind this unprecedented inclusion of a queen in military deliberations. Nefertari studied her husband's profile, still largely unreadable to her despite their weeks of marriage. "There are factions within the military itself," she said slowly, realization dawning, "just as there are within the priesthood and nobility. By including me, you disrupted the established patterns of alliance and opposition." Ramses turned to face her fully, and she saw a new appreciation in his gaze. "You see quickly, wife, but you risk alienating those who believe a woman has no place in such matters," she observed. "I risk more by allowing entrenched factions to dictate Egypt's military strategy." Something hardened in his expression. "My father allowed his generals too much independence, too much opportunity to build personal power bases within the army. I will not make the same mistake." Nefertari recognized the rare moment of personal revelation for what it was, a glimpse behind the divine mask to the man who calculated and planned with such precision. It was perhaps the most honest exchange they had shared since their wedding. "And what of your wife's place in all this?" she asked quietly. "What role do you envision for me beyond today's disruption of the council's expectations?" Ramses studied her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "That depends on you," he replied. "Today you showed insight and courage, speaking your mind despite the resistance of men who have commanded armies for decades. But tomorrow may bring different challenges. I am not afraid of challenges, Divine One." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, I begin to see that you are not." He moved closer, until barely an arm's length separated them. "Egypt faces enemies on all sides, Nefertari. Some beyond our borders, others within. I need allies I can trust, minds that see what others miss." "And you believe I might be such an ally?" she asked, scarcely believing the turn their conversation had taken. "I believe you have shown potential," he amended, the personal moment giving way once more to the measured pharaoh. Whether that potential develops into something valuable to Egypt remains to be seen. Despite the cool assessment, Nefertari felt a surge of something unexpected, not just pride at his recognition of her abilities, but a deeper sense of connection to this complex man who remained a mystery in so many ways. "I will not disappoint you," she said, the words emerging with more feeling than she had intended. Ramses regarded her with an unreadable expression. "My disappointment would be inconsequential," he replied. "It is Egypt you must not fail." With that, he strode from the chamber, leaving Nefertari alone with the map and its silent armies, the figurines frozen in their positions of strategic advantage and vulnerability, not unlike the real people they represented, herself included. Later that evening, as Nefertari prepared for the night, a messenger arrived bearing a small wooden chest sealed with the royal cartouche. "From the living Horus," the messenger announced, bowing deeply before withdrawing. Curious, Nefertari broke the seal and opened the chest. Inside lay a beautifully crafted Senate board, its squares inlaid with ivory and lapis lazuli. The playing pieces, carved from alabaster and obsidian, were arranged in the middle of a game, as though awaiting the next move. A small papyrus scroll accompanied the gift. Nefertari unrolled it to find a message written in the formal hieroglyphic script used for royal proclamations, but the words themselves were surprisingly personal. "For one who understands that victory belongs to those who see the entire board, not merely their own pieces. Your move, wife." Meret gasped softly over her shoulder. A royal gift, and such a personal one. Indeed, it was far more personal than anything Ramses had offered before. Not jewelry to adorn her as a royal possession, not ceremonial objects to mark her status, but a game of strategy and intellect, an acknowledgement of her mind. Nefertari studied the board carefully, noting the cleverly disadvantageous position in which the pharaoh had placed her pieces. A test, then, a challenge to see if she could extricate herself from a difficult situation. With a slight smile, she moved one of the alabaster pieces to an unexpected position. It appeared to weaken her stance further, but 3 moves ahead, it would create an opportunity her opponent might not anticipate. "Tell the pharaoh his wife accepts his challenge," she instructed the waiting servant, "and I have made my move." As the servant departed with the Senate board, Nefertari felt a strange lightness in her chest. The War Council had changed something fundamental in her marriage to Ramses, had transformed what had begun as a political arrangement into something with the potential for true partnership. Whether that potential would be realized remained uncertain. The road ahead still bristled with dangers from all quarters: Meret's unrelenting hostility, the priesthood's suspicion, the factions that sought to control the pharaoh through those closest to him. But for the first time since her arrival at the palace, Nefertari felt something beyond resignation to her fate. She had found her footing in this treacherous new world, had discovered strengths she hadn't known she possessed, and perhaps, just perhaps, she had begun to glimpse the man behind the golden mask of divinity, a man capable of recognizing value in unexpected places, a man who might in time come to see her as more than a political necessity or a diplomatic asset. As she prepared for sleep, Nefertari wondered what the coming days would bring. The Hittite campaign loomed on the horizon, with all its uncertainties and dangers. The court continued its subtle warfare of whispers and alliances, and somewhere in the vast palace complex, a pharaoh contemplated his next move on a Senate board, and perhaps in matters of greater consequence as well. The challenges in their marriage had only begun to reveal themselves, but for the first time, Nefertari faced them not with fear, but with a growing sense of her own capability. Whatever game the gods had set before her, she was determined to play it with all the skill and courage she could muster. The desert wind whipped sand across the barren landscape as Nefertari peered from her covered litter. What should have been a routine return from inspecting the temple construction at Abydos had become perilous as a sandstorm engulfed their small procession. "We must find shelter," called Mentu, captain of her guard. "The Divine One has ordered us to the old watchpost ahead." Suddenly arrows whistled through the air. "Bedouin raiders!" someone shouted. Guards formed a protective circle as Ramses leapt from his chariot, sword drawn. "Run for the rocks ahead," Mentu commanded, thrusting Nefertari toward a cluster of boulders. She ran as she'd never run before, her feet slipping in the sand. Ramses materialized beside her, face streaked with dust and blood, urging her forward until they reached shelter. "Stay here," he ordered before returning to battle. For what seemed an eternity, Nefertari huddled alone as the sounds of combat were swallowed by the howling wind. When the storm finally subsided and darkness fell, she emerged to find the desert empty. "You should not have left the shelter," came Ramses' voice behind her, causing her heart to leap with relief. "The others?" she asked hesitantly. "Scattered. We cannot move until dawn." He examined a cut on his arm, refusing to acknowledge the injury, even as Nefertari insisted on cleaning it with a strip of her shawl and precious drops from her water skin. "You fought well today," she said softly. "Like Montu himself, I was trained for battle from childhood. My father believed a pharaoh must be a warrior first, a ruler second. And what do you believe? The question slipped out unbidden. After a long silence, he replied, a pharaoh must be whatever Egypt needs. Warrior, diplomat, judge, god. We wear each mask as circumstances demand. And which mask do you wear now, Divine One? His eyes met hers in the gloom. Perhaps none. Perhaps that is the true danger. As the temperature dropped rapidly, Ramses gestured to the space beside him. Come, body heat is our only defense against the night. Hesitantly, Nefertari moved closer, tensing momentarily when his arm encircled her shoulders before relaxing into his warmth. Under the canopy of stars, they spoke with unexpected candor. Ramses shared memories of stargazing with his father, while Nefertari admitted she'd never seen the heavens so clearly. Palace walls, while they protect, also confine, Ramses observed. Sometimes I wonder if a pharaoh, surrounded by protocol and tradition, can ever truly see clearly. I think that depends on whether the pharaoh seeks to see beyond those walls. He turned to her. And you, Nefertari, do you see beyond the walls that surround you? I try, she answered honestly, though it's not always clear what lies beyond. Something shifted between them, an indefinable change that had nothing to do with the desert wind and everything to do with their unexpected intimacy. For the first time, Nefertari saw not the living Horus, but simply Ramses, a man with doubts he revealed to almost no one. They slept side by side beneath the stars, and when dawn broke, they set out across the sand to rejoin their guards. With each step toward civilization, Ramses withdrew into his pharaonic persona, yet something had changed between them. The Divine One refused all escort to search for you himself, Mentu informed her later. He said finding you was his responsibility alone. As they boarded the royal barge, surrounded once more by ceremony and formality, Ramses paused briefly beside her. Some walls, he said softly, are worth looking beyond. Then he was gone, surrounded once more by the protective barriers of protocol. Nefertari watched as the desert receded. The moment they had shared might never be repeated, but something had changed, a seed of understanding, perhaps even affection, that neither sand nor time could easily erase. Nefertari entered Luxor Palace to cold stares and whispers. The vast columned halls echoed with judgment as she followed a steward to her chambers. Merit, the great royal wife, waited there, regal and beautiful. So this is Ramses' desert flower, Merit said with cutting sweetness. They say you survived raiders together. How convenient. Nefertari met her gaze steadily. The gods protected us both. The gods have protected our union for 12 years, Merit replied. Remember your place here. Later, alone with Merit, Nefertari whispered, who is Merit, truly? They say she was his childhood love, but something changed between them. Some speak of a tragedy. That night, Ramses appeared at her doorway, eyes revealing a momentary warmth before court masks fell back into place. She bewitched him in the desert, hissed a nobleman to the high priest. The pharaoh speaks of making her great royal wife. Impossible. The priest's knuckles whitened around his staff. Merit is of royal blood. This Theban girl cannot supplant her. In shadowed corners, plots thickened. Poison in a wine cup. Scorpions in sandals. Henutmaya, the pharaoh's sister, warned Nefertari. They move against you. 3 nobles and the high priest claim you're unworthy. That night, as Ramses and Nefertari shared a rare private meal, he studied her face. They underestimate you, he said softly. As they once underestimated me. His eyes held a question. Her slight nod sealed their alliance. The ancient papyrus has been found, announced the high priest triumphantly. The pharaoh must marry one chosen by Amun's priesthood. Nefertari watched Ramses' face remain impassive as whispers erupted through the court. That night, she found a hidden passage to the royal archives. By lamplight, she examined the so-called ancient decree. The seal is wrong, she told Ramses the next morning, and the reed marks are fresh. His eyes gleamed with dangerous approval. You've given me the weapon I need. We shall expose them together, she replied, her heart racing as his fingers intertwined with hers for one brief electric moment. Before the assembled court, Ramses held up the falsified decree. This forgery, he thundered, is treason against Egypt itself. The high priest paled. Divine One, I merely discovered... Silence, Ramses cut through the lie. The seal is of my grandfather's time, yet claims to be from my father's reign. Vizier Keeper stepped forward unexpectedly. It was Merit who commissioned the forgery, Divine One. I have witnesses. A collective gasp rippled through the court as Merit's carefully composed face crumbled. Ramses stood tall, his hand finding Nefertari's. I choose my own queen, he declared. Egypt's future will not be dictated by false prophets or bitter hearts. The lotus flower on her pillow held a papyrus scroll within its petals. Nefertari unrolled it with trembling fingers. Leave while you still breathe. Your marriage ceremony will become your funeral. Merit rushed in. My queen! Merit has fled to her family's estate with Kepa. That night, Ramses found Nefertari on her balcony, staring at the stars. You received it too, he said, showing an identical threat. I'm not afraid, she whispered. You should be, he replied, touching her cheek. But we face this together. Tomorrow, I post royal guards at every entrance. Her heart soared at that simple word. Together. Under moonlight on the palace terrace, Ramses finally shed his royal mask. I never wanted marriage, he confessed, voice low. After Merit's betrayal years ago, I swore to keep all at a distance. Then my father's death forced alliances I never sought. Nefertari listened, scarcely breathing. I chose you for political advantage, he continued. Your family's connections to the priesthood, nothing more. He turned, his eyes revealing unexpected emotion. But now I cannot imagine ruling without you beside me, not for Egypt's sake, but for my own. And the great royal wife title, she asked softly, is yours, he answered. If you still want this complicated man behind the crown, the stars aligned for us, Nefertari said, fingers intertwined with Ramses as dawn broke over the palace gardens. Not my father's debts, not political necessity, but something greater. The goddess Hathor herself, he agreed with rare tenderness. Even a pharaoh cannot fight destiny. Preparations for the great royal wife ceremony proceeded swiftly. Nobles who once scorned Nefertari now bowed deeply. The remaining priests blessed her path. I was forced into this marriage, she whispered to Ramses that evening, but I would choose it freely now. As would I, he replied, the weight of divine kingship momentarily lifted from his shoulders. Perhaps the gods are wiser than we knew. In the sacred garden of Isis, away from court eyes, Nefertari clutched her grandmother's amulet. I love you, she confessed softly, the words hanging between them like fragile papyrus. Not the pharaoh, but the man who searched the desert alone to find me. Ramses stood silent, his expression unreadable. Her heart faltered. Then he knelt before her, the divine ruler of Egypt on his knees. Since the night beneath the stars, he said, voice rough with emotion, I have fought this feeling. Our pharaoh cannot afford such vulnerability. He pressed her palm to his heart. Yet here it remains. I love you, Nefertari, my queen, my heart. Their kiss sealed a covenant deeper than any royal decree. The great temple of Karnak fell silent as a new high priest unrolled an ancient papyrus. This decree, bearing the true seal of the divine Seti, states the pharaoh's heir must marry one approved by the gods. Ramses stood impassive, Nefertari beside him. The signs have been read, continued the priest. The omens consulted. Heart-pounding Nefertari awaited judgment. The gods have spoken through sacred Ibis and rising Nile. Nefertari, daughter of Amenhotep, whose grandmother carried royal blood, is deemed worthy by divine will to be great royal wife. Unexpected tears filled her eyes as Ramses squeezed her hand, his public restraint slipping just enough to reveal his relief. Merit and Keeper have been captured, General Amenemhat announced. Attempting to flee to Hittite territory with royal secrets. Before the assembled court, the disgraced pair knelt. The forged decree was merely one plot, Ramses declared, fury contained beneath regal calm. They have conspired with our enemies for years. Scrolls of evidence damned them. Secret messages, promised territories, planned assassinations. Merit raised her chin defiantly. You never loved me after our son died. Egypt deserved a pharaoh with his heart intact. A pharaoh needs his heart to rule justly, Ramses replied, his hand finding Nefertari's. Something you never understood. The sentence, eternal exile, the ultimate Egyptian punishment. By royal decree, Ramses announced from his throne, Nefertari resplendent beside him. I declare the marriage between Ramses, living Horus, and Nefertari, daughter of Mut, lawful and blessed by the gods. The court erupted in cheers, genuine now, not the hollow adulation of sycophants. Merit and Kepa are banished beyond Egypt's borders forever, he continued. Let their names be forgotten. Later, as temple singers practiced wedding hymns, Ramses led Nefertari to a secluded garden. "Tomorrow you become great royal wife," he said tenderly. "But today, tell me honestly, are you content with this destiny thrust upon you?" Her answer was a kiss that silenced even the ever-vigilant guards into embarrassed discretion. Karnak Temple blazed with 1,000 lamps as Nefertari processed beneath a canopy of gold. Lotus blossoms carpeted her path. Musicians played harps and sistrum. Ramses awaited at the sanctuary, not as conqueror, but as a man transfigured by unexpected love. When their hands joined before the statue of Amun-Ra, witnesses swore the god's stone face smiled. "I take you as great royal wife," Ramses declared, his voice carrying through the vast columns. "Your name shall be written beside mine for eternity." The crown of double plumes settled on her brow, heavier than expected, yet she stood tall. "Two souls," proclaimed the high priest, "joined as one before gods and men. May their love endure like the pyramids themselves." Royal apartments glowed with oil lamps and scattered lotus petals. Guards withdrew to distant posts as Ramses led his bride through cedar doors, inlaid with ivory. "At last," he whispered, "no ceremonies between us." His fingers trembled slightly as they removed her crown, the mighty pharaoh, conqueror of nations, humbled by love. "I feared this day would never come," Nefertari admitted, as her ceremonial robes fell away. "The gods delayed our happiness to ensure we earned it," he replied, drawing her close. Their kiss deepened as royal personas dissolved into pure emotion. Golden armbands clattered to marble floors. Whispered endearments replaced formal titles. Two souls, once strangers forced together by circumstance, now entwined by choice under heaven's watchful gaze. Dawn light filtered through alabaster screens as Nefertari awoke beside her husband. His sleeping face looked younger, the lines of authority softened in repose, unburdened by divine responsibility. She studied him in these rare, peaceful moments, the strong profile immortalized on countless monuments throughout Egypt, now vulnerable and human in the gentle morning light. The events of the past months cascaded through her mind like the waters of the Nile, her father's crushing debt, the dreaded journey to the palace, the court intrigues that had nearly destroyed them both, and the unexpected flowering of love in the most unlikely of gardens. She had entered this marriage as a sacrifice, a pawn in the great game of power, only to emerge as a queen in truth as well as title. From her balcony, Nefertari watched Egypt stirring to life below. Farmers waded into distant fields, their figures tiny against the vast patchwork of green and brown that stretched to the horizon. Fishing boats dotted the sacred river, their white sails billowing in the morning breeze. Columns of temple smoke rose to heaven like prayers, connecting the realm of men to the domain of gods. All this now fell under her protection as great royal wife, not merely a consort, but a partner in the divine rule of the two lands. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders, surprisingly welcome, after a lifetime of preparation she hadn't known she was receiving. Her grandmother's lessons in statecraft, her childhood fascination with military history, her careful study of human nature, all had been preparing her for this destiny she could never have imagined. "What thoughts occupy my queen so early?" Ramses asked, his voice still rough with sleep, as he joined her at the balcony's edge. His hand came to rest beside hers on the cool limestone, not quite touching yet aware of her presence like a flame senses the air around it. "How strangely fate weaves its tapestry," she replied, turning to face him. In private, away from the formal masks they wore in court, his eyes revealed the man she had come to love, thoughtful, complex, carrying the weight of millions with a strength that had been forged through both victory and loss. "I came here as sacrifice, yet found my purpose." His fingers bridged the small distance between them, capturing hers with gentle firmness. "And I found my heart when I'd thought it forever lost," he admitted, the confession still new enough to carry a hint of wonder. "After Merit's betrayal and my son's death, I believed that part of me was buried too deep to resurrect." "The heart knows its own time for healing," Nefertari said softly, remembering the stories of his past she'd gathered in fragments. The young prince who had loved too deeply, lost too much, and walled himself away behind the impenetrable mask of pharaonic divinity. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her back against his chest as they faced the awakening kingdom together. This simple intimacy, unthinkable months ago, now felt as essential as breath itself. "The court scribe asked yesterday what words I wish carved beside your image in the new temple," Ramses said, his chin resting lightly on her head. I told him to inscribe his great royal wife, who he loves, mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nefertari, beloved of Mut. Tears pricked her eyes at the significance of those words, not merely the formal title, but the public declaration of love that would stand for centuries in stone. "And what shall they write of you, my pharaoh?" she asked, blinking away the unexpected emotion. His low chuckle vibrated against her back. "Whatever fearsome declarations will best intimidate our enemies, I suppose. Smiter of Hittites and Great Bull of Victory and other such nonsense. While I know the man who searches desert sands to find his lost wife," she teased gently, turning in his embrace to face him, "who plays Senet late into the night and lets me win only sometimes." "I never let you win," he protested with mock indignation. "Your strategy is simply unexpectedly effective." Together they laughed, the sound carrying across the private royal garden below where lotus blossoms floated on tranquil pools. A sound rarely heard within palace walls, yet one that servants would gradually become accustomed to in the years to come. Together they watched the sun climb higher, painting the white city of Memphis in hues of gold and amber. The first petitioners would soon arrive in the audience hall, bringing the day's business of governance that never ceased. Priests would perform their morning rituals, scribes would prepare their papyri, generals would await the pharaoh's commands. The machinery of empire would resume its relentless motion. But for this moment, this precious private moment, they stood not as divine ruler and royal wife, but simply as Ramses and Nefertari, two souls who had found each other against impossible odds, whose lives had been transformed by forces greater than themselves. "Are you ready?" he asked, the question encompassing far more than just the day ahead. Nefertari nodded, her heart full with the certainty of her place in this new life. "Together," she answered, the word both a promise and a prayer. Hand in hand they turned from the balcony to prepare for their first full day as true partners, in love, in rule, in the destiny that had brought them together and would bind their names for all eternity. Isn't it remarkable how the twists of fate can lead us to unexpected destinations? Just like Nefertari, who entered the palace as a sacrifice only to find her true purpose and deepest love, many of us discover our greatest blessings in what initially appears to be our darkest moments. What moment in your own life seemed like a burden at first, but revealed itself as a blessing later? Have you ever been forced into a situation that unexpectedly changed your life for the better? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. The courage Nefertari showed in the face of court intrigue reminds us that true strength often comes not from power, but from integrity and wisdom. And Ramses' journey from cold, calculating ruler to a man who could love again shows us that even the most guarded hearts can heal. If this story moved you to tears or made your heart race with anticipation, please consider subscribing to our channel for more tales that celebrate the triumph of love against impossible odds. Each week we travel through time and across continents to bring you stories that remind us of our shared humanity. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new chapter in our ongoing saga of historical romances. And if you haven't yet seen our previous video about Cleopatra's secret diaries, you absolutely must watch it for another emotional journey through Egypt's royal courts. Until next time, may your own love story be as enduring as the pyramids, as deep as the Nile, and as beautiful as Nefertari and Ramses' unexpected journey from arrangement to affection. Remember, the most precious treasures aren't gold or jewels, but the connections we forge with others, sometimes in the most unexpected circumstances.